Good morning, everyone. You can probably tell that we really like plants at my house. Here I have some sunflowers that I planted, and they're going to go outside when it gets a little warmer. Over here we've got some tomatoes and some eggplants and some basil and some other veggies that are just growing a little bit before they can go outside. But today's story takes place in a garden plot. It's a plot in a community garden, and it's a plot that has no gardener. One spring, no gardener came to rent this plot. No gardener came to put plants there. All the plots around it had gardeners, and they had rows of plants growing, and they had fences, and they had trellises, but this plot had nothing. Well, that's not really true, because this plot had earthworms. Brown, wiggly worms down in the dirt, doing the things that earthworms do, eating and pooping and aerating the soil. As the worms burrow down, they make holes that get filled with air, and the air and the sun and the water and the compost left by the previous gardener are what feed that garden. Well, the worms were concerned that no gardener had come along, and they wished that a gardener was there working. They looked at the other plots and they saw flying things like bees and butterflies, and they thought, oh, if we had flying things like that, we could attract a gardener to our plot. But they didn't know how they could get those flying things to come there without flowers. One day one of the worms was sitting near the edge of the plot, and there was a big weed growing up nearby, and he noticed that there was a big yellow and black caterpillar inching its way up the stem of that plant. And then it worked its way across one of the leaves, and it just hung from the bottom of the leaf. And as the worm watched, the caterpillar disappeared into a shell, a green shell that hung there from the bottom of the leaf. The worm went to get some of his friends, and they came and saw it, and they watched it. Nothing seemed to be happening, and they gave up and they left. But every day they would come back, and they would check to see if anything was happening, but nothing was happening. Until finally, one day, as they watched, that green casing turned clear, and they could see color inside, and then it started to break open, and something was flapping its wings, and out flew a butterfly. And the worm said, oh, if we could change ourselves into butterflies, then maybe we could attract a gardener to come to our plot. Well, they didn't have any way to make a chrysalis like that for themselves, but they knew a centipede who could knit. Now, have you ever seen anybody knit on their arms? They use their arms like knitting needles. Well, the centipede could do that. And so she agreed to knit them a chrysalis. And she crawled up the stem of that plant with it and out onto the leaf, and she hung the chrysalis from the bottom of the leaf. Now the earthworms started discussing and arguing about who was going to go into that chrysalis and become something else. After a long time of arguing, one of the worms just decided that he was going, and so he inched his way up the stem and across that leaf and wiggled his way into the chrysalis. And a couple of other worms saw him, and not to be left behind, they went up the stem, over the leaf, and down into that chrysalis. And again that happened, and pretty soon there were 7 earthworms all jammed together inside that chrysalis, and it wouldn't hold any more. And so they all wiggled themselves together in there to wait. They waited. And while they waited, they wondered, what would they become? Would they become a flying creature with bold, beautiful wings like a butterfly? Would they become a creature with little tiny wings like a bee? Would they have the beautiful, iridescent wings of a dragonfly? What were they going to become? And then they wondered about the gardener that they would attract. What type of gardener would that be? Would it be someone who would plant things in nice, neat rows? Would it be a gardener who would put in supports for the plants, or one that would just let them grow all over the ground? Would the gardener put in a bench to let people come and sit near the garden? They wondered a lot about their becoming. Well, the chrysalis hung there in the sun and in the rain and in the wind, and eventually it started to unravel. And the wind caught a hold of the end of that yarn and pulled it, and it all unraveled, and then out came 7 brown, wiggly earthworms, fell to the ground. And they looked around their plot, and they saw there was still no gardener there. They wiggled themselves down into the dirt, and they found that the garden was becoming something while they were away. The other earthworms had been busily eating and pooping and aerating the soil, and there had been some plants left over from before that started to come back. There were seeds in the compost that the other gardener had put there that were starting to sprout. There were seeds that some birds had dropped that were starting to grow. It was starting to become a garden. Kind of wild, kind of messy, but a garden nonetheless. And the worms thought, well, maybe it's okay that we don't have a gardener for now. Maybe if the garden grows with some flowers and some veggies, a gardener might come along. I think that next spring, a gardener is going to come along to plant there. Because a good gardener is going to recognize that that soil is ready to be planted. Well, that's the story of our South Church garden. We're just all those earthworms getting that soil ready. Looking forward to when we can be together at that garden again.